already about transition plans and organizing according to what might make us most effective. So I'll just start as a sample maybe. So Howard Griffin been coming here in November. It'll be 13 years. And what I'm thinking about, what I'm most excited about, I was showing him the map of our global missions, and having been in Spain recently, of course we went last summer, that was great. And just to see how there are all these great mission opportunities. For instance, we're helping, I don't know if you know this, we're helping finance the building of some churches in Egypt, in Cairo. The Egyptian government is, because Cairo is such a densely populated city, they're wanting to grow the suburbs. So one of the ways they do that is by giving license to build churches, thinking that'll help move the people out in the suburbs. And so it's really unique because Egypt doesn't do that. And so we're in on that. And because we've been a good steward of the resources that God's given to us, as you know, we've been taking whatever overage we ever have and we put it into a missions endowment or into our building endowment or into other succession program fund. Wow, we can take this money and use it for God's kingdom purposes. So I'm just really excited about what we're doing globally. Excited about everything, but I'd say that's one of my greater excitements. So where do we go here, Ruth? Go on.
Yes, my name's Ruth Whitehead, and I've been coming, my oldest will turn 36 this year, and so we've been coming since a year before that time, and at least. So what I'm most excited about, I don't know, I think there's just, for me, there's a sense of winds of change in our church, and I think the change is just a really focus on each other and about looking at how we can connect with each other. And I'm excited about getting to be a part of a triad, and there's some challenges to the triad, and it's very real, and it's very, people have, my friends in the triad have issues, and it's interesting. It's going to be interesting to see where God leads us with, my being a part of that triad and seeing what God will do to guide that. So anyway, that's what I'm excited about.
I'm Phyllis Fields. I've been a member since 1980. Was single and met my husband in the singles class. And when I first joined, it's been a long time ago, it was a lot more stuffy and staid and old money, and it's gotten to be a lot more service-oriented, all the different kinds of ways to serve in town and out of the country. And so I think it's, I've really been enjoying seeing the change also.
My name's Julie McCracken, and I grew up in this church. I was baptized as a baby in this church and married in my 20s, moved to Houston for 10 years and then back here in 2004 approximately. And this is my home church. I love this church family. When I did come back, I saw people that just put their hands around me and hugged me. It's just such a family loving church, and now I've gotten to be an elder, and I love being an elder and reaching out to the church family in various ways through the Nuffs. I teach the 4th and 5th graders, so that's a big switch, and I have a triad, and we're going to be reading the Bible as the New Testament. And I'm already in a Bible recap with about 7 or 8 ladies where we've been reading the Bible all year for our 2nd year. I've just learned so much from reading the Bible. And I am part of the Canyon Community Mission, and that's such a, I just have this feeling of evangelism and reaching out and talking about my faith. And I've been learning more about prayer. And so I'm just all on fire right now.
So you're only excited about 12 things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not just one. You can't limit one.
I'm sorry. Anyway, I'll stop. I'm excited. I love the way you started your sermon today. I love to talk about creation and the miracle of the body and God creating us.
So Murray, I don't know if you heard how long you've been here, what you're most excited about.
I'm talking about Dana thing. So one of my favorite authors is Philip Yancey, but then Paul Brand. Paul Brand, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. Fearfully, all his 3 books he wrote, In His Image, of the book. So a little bit of that was, when you're talking about that biology stuff, that's kind of cool. I like that stuff. Well, Howard, I got to back you up on the mission stuff, bro. That's you know about that stuff. It's very exciting. It's very exciting. Between Greg Hurst in Bolivia, the underground church in Iran. I was in Istanbul probably 3 months ago. Met a bunch of Iranian house church leaders. Went there with the Outreach Foundation. Yep. Did that. And then we have 3 folks. Our folks are going with Jen, with Nate. I was on that little call. We had So 3 folks from our church are going to Egypt with a prayer conference, which is pretty exciting. Glad Nate's going too. You sent Nate. That's good. And Jen both going. So that's great stuff. Something really Howard helped start, and I wish we'd done a lot of years, is our little discipleship groups. You both implied that, but groups of 4. I mean, I love our Bible studies and stuff. They're great, but I like the idea of 4 guys. You meet. If one guy doesn't show, you still meet. But and then we work through Greg Ogden, Fuller, with Greg. Maybe Howard showed you that stuff. But so Greg's stuff, it's really good. So that is something I think is really exciting.
Mike Smiley, I think probably I've been here 10 to 12 years combined. So I went away for a few years and I came back. I guess the thing I'm most excited about is the Canyon growth. But I also like the direction that we've gone with trying to help Howard and everybody administer the church as well. And, kind of the change in, what elders do versus what they used to do, which I find a lot more refreshing and enjoyable. So.
I'm Matt Klein. I started helping with the youth group over 20 years ago, but I've been a member for probably 15 years. And I'm in a transition with my Sunday school right now, with the college stuff. I'm really kind of moving to Canyon. So I'm just excited for what's coming next. Just getting to see the other things going on and finding a new spot for now.
Kent, you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Kent Buchanan. I've been here since as long as Howard has. 2012, wasn't it?
No, I've been here since 2010.
2010. Okay, so it's about the same length of time. And one of the things that I'm looking really forward to is working with Lee Price. And I asked him at a men's retreat. He's a fisherman and a fisherman of men. I've asked him to teach me to become both a fisherman and a fisherman of men. And so recently he invited me to join up, so I'll be leaving here around 3 to run down there for that in Canyon. We've got some training, 3 or 3:30.
David.
And I'm David Terry. We joined in February of 2021, so I like to say that Murray got me in a headlock, but I was really at that point in my life seeking pastoral leadership, and Murray discipled me through lots of transition, put me in some groups, and I'm just excited to be a part of a church of disciples making disciples. And I see that is workplace ministry, what we're doing, just from, as I looked at that occupational, or the operations checkup, just to see how much alignment we're in, from staff to committees that I'm on, the governance of this church, the way that things are operating, I just see a lot of potential in where we are and where we're going. So I'm excited about that.
Great. Leslie, can you go next?
Sure. I'm Leslie. I've been here 6 years. And I guess I'm most excited about our triad, our Sunday school class, and how those things are growing and meeting, younger families that are coming to the church.
Dwayne?
Well, Dwayne Hart. We first started coming here in 1973 after we got married, and we're on our 3rd cycle here, like a lot of people have said. It's our church family. We're attached to all these people, and you are welcome back with open arms when you do come back. So that is a cool feature of our congregation. I'm also excited about the educational, the discipleship training that we do in all of the Sunday schools that seem to be all well attended these days. What a great thing for a downtown church to have a lively, active Sunday school program.
Lindsay Palmer, I've been here 8 years, kind of on the same guidelines of seeing the explosion of people our age and younger. You know, used to it was like they wanted to sleep in on Sundays, you know, but everything's shifting it seems, and it seems like there's this new hunger, and it's just really drawing people in, and I'm excited about that.
Shelley Shalupka, and I've been here 28 years, hard to believe. And it's always been the people, the love and the grace of the people in this church. And ditto, I'm so excited about the young couples that are in our church right now. And that Murray and Kim started the Triple T class to kind of undergird them and you know, disciple them, and just the enthusiasm that they have in their walk with Christ. And it just gives me so much hope for the future.
I'm Robert Smith. I believe we've been here 5 years, plus a couple of 3 months or something. And I'm the most excited about the way the Spirit is driving my mind and heart. And what has in mind for me to do exactly, I don't really know. But I know it's going to be within His will, in His time, and may God receive every piece of glory, if there is any, for what we're about to try to do, and expect a miracle. And we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. Everything, not just most things. And that's me.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing. That's always a good perspective, and I made a little notes kind of quickly as you all were talking. So just reminding you, and I said this a little bit in the letter, kind of how we got into this sort of conversation today. You know, Howard had initially said that we're going to be looking for someone for intergenerational ministries, and he was talking to Nate, who is on our staff that you mentioned is going. I'm actually going to London right after you guys are going to Egypt, so I can't go to that. I'm working with the Iranian Leaders Fellowship on how do they organize for movement. So
Cezanne?
With Cezanne and Mirdad and all of that. So it's fun. I enjoy the role, and so Nate had said, so Nate's on our staff, and he said, hey, maybe you should talk to Dana, because just part of my own background, and Howard was asking, how did you get into this role and so forth, and part of my own background was my research for my doctorate was in revitalization and transformation of medium and large congregations. So I was part of of 2 congregations that went through aspects of transformation. One was a smaller congregation that was basically said, we can afford to pay you 2 years, and then we run out of money. And I said, okay. I was young and I would say stupid. I was passionate, and I still am. And God did great things. Then I went to a different church and also had revitalization there. But the dynamics of the church are really different in different sizes. So when I was talking to Howard and talking about here's the great things going on in Canyon and driving around, and really for those of you who were in the contemporary service, I really do mean this when I say it, so don't show this tape to other people. But sometimes I will say to congregations, oh, I'm excited about your future. I really am excited about your future here and what God is doing, and I really feel like, man, there is so much opportunity for what God can do in and through you. And there's always opportunity for that, but I think you all are in a different stage of being ready and willing and desiring that than I see in many congregations. So I say that because I do. I talk to a lot of congregations, I talk to a lot of sessions and go, you're gonna, sometimes say, man, you're really gonna have to change the mindset of people, and that's not as much the case here. So I think people have seen the Spirit move and have, you're excited about smaller discipleship groups, which are indeed, I think, what a great way for people to grow. You're moving in the Canyon direction, and when I drove my son out to Baylor, we drove through Amarillo, and I said, man, there are some good pockets here that can have some great influence. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for the church going forward, but one of the challenges can be, what's your underlying operating system? And how do you think of yourself as a church? How are you functioning as a church? What's the best way to utilize the people that you have? So when I had started to talk to Howard about that position and what was going on, I said it might be helpful to say, let's have a little bit of a conversation about some of the fundamentals of how churches operate. Because sometimes what can happen is we have a vision. Like if I have a vision to run a marathon, but I don't eat right and I don't exercise, I'm never going to run. Like I can have a picture on my wall and I can, there's the New York Marathon and I paid my money and I did all that. But if I'm not preparing myself for that, I'm never going to be able to do it. And so part of this here is to say, have a little bit, I'll teach on some things, but also have some discussion on some of these elements and how it applies to your church or not. So I want to do it through two different lenses. One is the first sheet that you have here on church size dynamics, so I want to go through that. And then we'll talk a little bit about what you worked on with the EOS, the Entrepreneurial Operating System, which is a corporate tool, but I also find it actually extremely helpful in the church world as well. So I know sometimes the questions don't always, well, what does this mean, or what does this mean in our context? There's certainly some translation that's needed, but it basically says what's the underlying operation that will help you get to the next step. You need other ones? You need more? Does anyone need one more? Okay. So I want to go through that second. So we'll take a break after we go through the church size dynamic stuff, and then we'll move into the EOS stuff. So let me talk about church size dynamics, and I want to explain this a little bit, have you ask some questions, and then have you talk about it among your tables. What we do find is that churches of different sizes operate effectively in different ways. And most churches will have, especially churches when you get into the larger size, they will operate a little bit like one size and a little bit like another size. And so part of the question is, hey, in what ways do we need to kind of grow up? In what ways do we need to act the size we are? And in what ways do we need to act the size that we want to become? So, and it's not just, let me say, it's not just about getting more money, getting more people here, getting more this and that, but really it can be even through multiplication. If we have this kind of influence, I mean, I know you guys all, it's like we want a greater quantity and quality of disciples. How do we need to act to increase that versus how might a smaller church need to act to increase that as well? Okay, so let me just briefly explain things. I like this whiteboard paint. I used to have an office that was one wall with whiteboard paint.
Yeah.
I felt like Beautiful Mind or something. So you should always have to make sure you got the right pen for that, right? So
You're not going to throw calculus 2 up there.
no, I'm not gonna do that. In this dynamic, there are what we would say is organism, and then organization, and there's people-centered, and then there is pastor-centered. In a different and even sometimes potentially healthy way. And what we look at is average worship attendance for a couple of reasons. One is you can have a lot of churches, and especially in different areas, we have a lot of people on our rolls that we don't necessarily, that they're not active. We went through a capital campaign at my church in Florida, and we had the consultant that was working with us was a Baptist pastor who'd been at a large church, and he said, listen, I could give you 1,000 of my members, and I wouldn't know I lost them, and you wouldn't know you had them, right? Meaning they would simply just be on your mailing list, but you would never be seeing them. So membership isn't the greatest way. But worship attendance tends to be a little bit more of a good metric of what is the influence, what is the size of our church. Now, one challenge I will just say with worship attendance is that in the 1980s, some of you were saying, hey, I've been here 30 years or 37 years. In the 1980s, if you were a regular church member, you were there every Sunday unless you were sick or out of town, and people didn't travel the way they do now. People didn't necessarily, I'm away for all these weeks, weekends in the summer. So most people were there 4 Sundays out of the month. It was a rare time where someone wasn't there. In 2000, the Barna Group did a study of people that consider themselves regular attenders, how often do they show up? And you know what the number was? How often regular attender comes?
Twice a month.
Twice a month. It was technically 1.8 times a month was on average. Now I do wonder after COVID what the new average is. I think, my guess is, it's probably something like 1.2. You still have the people that are there every Sunday, but you have another people say, that's my church, but I'm only there, once every 6 months, kind of, or once every 6 weeks, or once every 2 months, or once a month. So part of the challenge is, if you had a church that in the 1980s served, had 1,000 people who were regularly part of your congregation, on any one Sunday, you would see 800 of those people, right? Now what can happen is if you have 1,000 people that call this church their home, over the course of 2 months, 1,000 different people come through it, you may have 300, right? Or 250 that are there on any one particular Sunday. So here's why it's important, is because the size of your congregation is probably bigger than it actually appears on a Sunday morning. Now, to make it even more complicated, once you have multiple services, so if you go to the service in the morning, the 8:30 service, especially if you're not involved in your Sunday school, you can come in and you can go out, and your image of your church is a 100-person church, right? Because you're not used to some of these other things. Or if you go to the traditional service or the contemporary service, so people can feel, and that's the expectations they place on a church, are the expectations that people place on smaller churches, not the expectations people place on the larger churches. Does that conceptually make sense? Okay. So let me talk about how these different dynamics work. Below 50 on a Sunday is what we call a family-sized church. And a family-sized church is there usually is a matriarch and patriarch of the church, and you don't do anything unless the matriarch and patriarch want to do it, right? They probably give more of the money, they probably have the extended family that is there, and if you cross that person, forget it. You're not going to get anything done. What people want from a pastor out of here is a chaplain, right? They don't want a leader, they want a chaplain. We want people like, you can preach to it, you can teach us, you can do our funerals and our weddings, but we're really not looking for the pastor to lead us into the future. You function very much as a chaplain. In a pastoral-sized church is 50 to 150, that's ish. And the challenge here is that it's what we call a pastoral-sized church. Because the people who are, usually there's one pastor that's there. So it's a solo pastor. It's not a part-time pastor because a church of this size can afford a full-time pastor. There might be a church administrator, or part-time choir director. Very minimal, but the pastor is really at the center of the ministry directly. Now, the pastor will still be centered here, but in a very different way. The pastor will be centered here directly, meaning that the pastor, if the pastor didn't show up to visit me, then I wasn't visited, right? If the pastor's not leading the Bible study, then it's not a real Bible study. If the pastor didn't announce my event from the pulpit, right, then it's not a real event. If the pastor is not, this is where the pastor is seen to be on 24/7 because, not that they're working all that time, but they at least need to be ready because at any point they may need to jump into that particular role. So it's a pastor-centered idea. Both of these are still organism type things. They are informal in their organization. So we know when a new person comes in because we haven't seen that person before. We don't have formal follow-up systems. We don't have formal ways of, how do we get people to become members or involved and so forth. When you come down here, you come into the organization type. You begin to be a little bit more organized. And this is a program size. So churches begin to have multiple staff that are a part of this. and they begin to have specialized staff. So we have a specialized, someone with children's ministry, someone for student ministry, someone, there's various things. Obviously, this is maybe 150 to 350-ish on a Sunday. And it's still group-centered, it's people-centered. So when a pastor leaves a church of this size, usually a lot of things continue on because it's not dependent upon the pastor in the same way. And it's not as vulnerable when a pastor leaves. It begins to get a little bit more formalized in terms of, well, maybe we have 2 services, and so how do we greet new people? How do we do these kind of things that larger churches need? And then there's a corporate-sized church, and pardon the name, but that's just what it's normally called. And that's 350 and above, and usually what happens is that every time that number doubles, it is a different threshold for how a church needs to operate. Still similar to other corporate-sized things, but when it goes from 300-ish, 300, 400 to 800 to 1,600, that begins to look a little bit different. Here, it is pastor-centered, but the pastor's primarily responsible for equipping people. So the pastor is the visionary, is the teacher. Really, things don't happen. There's more alignment within ministries and so forth. And so churches begin to operate a little bit more formally. So if you look at that corporate size, if you look at your sheet that I handed out, there's excellence, worship, and preaching. Ministry staff is specialized and properly trained, less likely to be hired from within. So a lot of times here, it's like, oh, we need a children's ministry person. Well, that person's a great volunteer. Let's make them the part-time children's ministry director. Nothing necessarily wrong with that. But when you go here, you just begin to look for more specialized ministry staff who can actually do these things. So greater level of niche ministry, pastor is centered and provides visionary leadership. Most susceptible to significant loss of membership when a pastor changes. So churches here are 50% more likely to lose half the people in a pastoral transition. So the church is a lot more vulnerable for a pastoral transition here than here or here. Here it happens all the time. But even here, that's fine, we'll get a new person to step in that role. But it often becomes so dependent upon this person. The challenge is, again, the kind of leadership that is needed here from the sessions. So somebody mentioned about, I like the way we're beginning to function a little bit differently as a session, and we're going to get more focused on we're not going to get into the weeds as much on particular ministry issues. The challenge is a church can be this size, but if people came from this size of a church, or the way they view church is like people that just come to 8:30, well, that's a pastoral size. So my expectation of Howard is of a pastoral sized church, not a corporate sized church. Okay? Let me stop there for a second. Does that make sense? And do you have questions about how this works or other examples or?
Yeah, I mean, the point about visiting, like
Yep.
Murray would visit them. They still want me to visit them too.
Right.
In the hospital. It's like I try to, but it's just like, he's holier than I am, probably. Murray's only kissed 3 girls in his whole life. I'll tell you.
Well, you're not many more than that.
Not many more. I'm a handful. Yeah, 5.
But some.
Yeah, a few more. But yeah.
Right. Well,
yeah,
right.
So there's kind of an expectation again. And again, I don't know. I came here 13 years ago, but it's just like I needed to do the visit, which is just a little odd. I'm like, well, Paul visited you or Murray visited you, and they ended up doing the funeral a lot too. But whatever, it's just an interesting expectation.
And even pastors in general needing to visit versus, when I was in Florida, we had, because that is God's waiting room. We had, wow. We had 70 shut-ins. So, and I said, listen, I believe in, and I didn't call it pastoral care, I called it congregational care. I believe in care, very important, and it's so important, I need to not be the primary one doing it. So I would do some things, but we trained a team of elders and deacons to extend the table of communion. So every single shut-in was visited, if they could receive, was visited once a month. There's no way I could visit 70 people. And so I want to replicate that and say, actually, that's better. And they formed such great relationships, whereas for me, it's like, I'm gonna have to get on to the next person, and it becomes challenging.
I was gonna say, isn't that kind of generational in a way, that attitude of, you know, the pastor needs to come see me, and in my experience, that seems to be the attitude that comes from an older generation.
Yeah, I think partly, but they're also the ones that primarily need to be seen. So it's hard to do it in this. It's hard to say it's just generational. I think it tends to lean that way a little bit, but to change that expectation from the congregation that, hey, because of this, we actually need to function in a little bit different of a way.
I just wanted to make a comment. I really hadn't thought about it recently, but I don't believe that this church visits people who are shut-ins or sick or one thing with communion. I'm used to doing that.
Mm-hmm.
I did it at First Church in Oklahoma City. I did it in Desert Hills Presbyterian Church in Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
So I would just ask Howard and Murray to consider getting us on the ball, and a pastor and a session member or elder goes around to everybody. If it's 60 people, let's do it.
Yeah.
Because I think it's important.
So, but here's the thing, if Howard and Murray have to do it, it can be challenging. What we allow is we allow us to extend the table where the two of you can go do it. So what we had after Communion Sunday is we had all of these portable communion sets,
Right.
you know, that we would go out. And so we had one person that coordinated it, and we had trained 16 people to go do it. So they went out 2 by 2s, and they got to visit everybody and have really good conversations.
I think in those days it was just, that was the way it was set up, like PCUSA. And,
Yeah.
And then the one in Arizona had jumped out of that too.
Yeah. So that's the traditional thing, but that's still going back to the pastor has to do it. And so which get part of the benefit, and part of the way I actually jumped into this position was not only because of working with medium and large church revitalization, but was also looking at how do you plant churches of missional communities when sacraments are so tied, and I believe in making sure that we administer the sacraments appropriately, but if it's so tied to, well, an ordained clergy has to do it in that way, versus we're gonna extend the table out, there are some great opportunities, which is then frees it up, because there's no way you could have your pastoral staff visit 60 people, yeah, with any sort of regularity.
And just a little background information for those who are newer. So Paul Fredrickson, when he was the worship and care director, he did homebound communion. And we had our elders before COVID visiting the hospitals quite regularly. COVID kind of shut that down. We're looking to resume that, but that's another staffing situation. We had Dan Carter. Dan is no longer on our staff, so he was helping with that. So we need to find another person to help manage that effort, coordinate that effort. Yeah.
And it could be what we did is we had a volunteer coordinator, and I taught, here's how you take communion. Like let's go through, let's make sure people understand. And what we call it is extending the table. So instead of just taking it, you're taking a tray and you're passing it down the row, in some sense you're just taking it right out to the hospital. But now when you're doing that, you're having to remind people of the sermon. Well, the great thing is these 16 people on Communion Sunday, they had to listen more intently to my sermon because they had to give a 5-minute recap. They had to read the passage and give a 5-minute recap to the people in the hospital, right? So I'm like, we're picking up on these ones. And I would give them little kind of clip notes and things like that. But that is, so imagine the power of being able to, and that's just an example, right? But the power of being able to have your pastoral staff equipping people for ministry rather than just simply doing the ministry. How much more could that free up? The places that Murray's talking about, Egypt and Iran, they don't have professional clergy in that way, and yet the gospel is spreading immensely because we're equipping lay people to do a lot of that kind of ministry.
Well, it's kind of maximizing the personnel that we have, and also that multiplication theory as well to do that.
For clarification,
Yep.
the average worship numbers in the church worship versus online and in the church?
So the hard thing is a lot of these numbers were birthed out of the 2000s when people weren't doing online in the same way. And online's a hard thing. I mean, I don't know how we totally count that. It's a challenge. I mean, you can count people that are online and so forth. But you know, we're really trying to measure engagement. And so I would say, I would say people that tend to watch online, unless they are bona fide shut-ins, is actually they're in general less engaged. I don't need to be here, I can just watch online. So they're probably, I would say most would not be in that particular category because they're great. I don't actually even have to come, I can just get it online whenever, wherever I want. So the church that I served, just to give you an illustration of this, we were functioned like a family church. Fortunately, the matriarch and patriarch died while I was, you know, when I came in. I mean, they went to Jesus, right? Yeah. And they were willing to grow, so we grew. I mean, we were functioned like this. We were on the low end of this. We grew to this size. But the challenge was, then I said, hey, now that we're at this size, and we had a part-time children's ministry person, and we had this, I said, we really need, you know, we really need to go to the next level. We need to make this shift. Now, the hard thing about this shift is, here you're transitioning from people to pastor. Here you're transitioning from pastor to people and organism to organization. That's why this is the hardest one to cross, because you have to change two different mindsets. The people and the organizations. And then where the congregation pushed back is that, well, no, I need to train small group leaders. No, we want you to do all the Bible studies. We want you to be the ones that visit. Didn't want to do some of those other things. So that's when I knew we're never gonna do here with this particular model, right? So when you think about this, also looking from here, there's probably some ways, by and large, that you're acting in both a little bit in the program and a little bit in the corporate. You know, probably a little bit. So what I want you to do is take that sheet and talk about it with the people on your table. You can look at the people in the pastoral centered as well, but particularly, where do you see the church functioning more like this or more like this or less like this? Because again, if we're going to fulfill the vision, and I want to talk about where God is taking you in the future, but the way to get there is to be able to function like here, is to be able to function in this direction. So I want you to talk about, well, here's a couple of ways or places where we may need to function more on this side than we have been. Is that understandable?
Yes.
One is the 350, is that like total at all three services?
Yep.
Or is that, okay.
Yep. So you're right in
You're
this.
there.
And by the way, I mean, we have a lot of congregations. I mean, it's interesting when you look at data, most churches fall on these lines because the line becomes a barrier. Now, I think a lot of the ways you're pushing this number higher because of the great capable staff and so forth that you have, but I do think there's ways in which your operational dynamics are holding you back from filling more and more like this. But we have so many congregations that are hovering around the 400-ish, 350 to 400 average attendance across all their services. And then they go up to 800. Had a church, just real quick, I mean, it plateaued at 791, which is also 800 is one of those thresholds. And then they started operating and they were 600. And I told them, I said, you're going to do one of two things. You're either, within 3 years, you will either go back to this. And again, it's not all just about numbers, right? I want to be a little careful of that. But I said, you're either going to go back to this, or you're going to start to act like this, and you're going to come to this level. And unfortunately, I was right, and within 3 years, they were here. Okay? So how we act the size we want to become. We need to be cognizant and careful of that. Okay? So take a couple minutes, talk about if you have new questions that come up. Feel free to, we'll have some time to debrief that, but talk about that in your group a little bit. We might need to enhance. Now you're all quiet.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, where's places that you looked and said, yes, this is like us, or here's some places where we're not acting the size that we are and we need to enhance?
We talked about having more people ask to join a small group or this group, and then we're looking for people who might like to do some of the work with us, and you look like you might be interested in that, and come once and see what you think about what the direction is and what they're planning to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And that gets more people involved in the church.
Right.
Work and not just listen to us and no.
And that's the thing where it needs to be formalized rather than, usually a lot of times, it's funny, you'll talk to churches and they'll say, oh yeah, I was asked right away to get involved in something. But for every person for whom that's the case, there's another person for whom I came and nobody asked me, and it's haphazard rather than formalized. And that's the difference as you get to the different sizes.
Well, Murray can never retire because now.
Yeah. Yes.
We didn't talk about this in our table, but coming out of COVID, wanting to restart some of these programs, this is a good time for us to have a conversation.
Yeah.
So that we can be intentional about getting these things fired up again.
I overheard your table here a little bit talking about, there's some people that go to some larger churches that don't do as much as your, and there's pros and cons to that. So it's great how much you do. Sometimes though, we can be spread too thin, and we have a hard time saying no to things. So that can also be, do we have directed effort, in particular areas? So it's just a questions that are considered. Did you have a?
Yeah, several. So we have a personnel organizational structure that is much more program related than corporate related.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're getting there, and we've identified some areas, but the org structure fits more of a program and lots of volunteers as opposed to a corporate structure that leads the effort.
And would you all, that's a very important point, and I agree. Do you all agree, do you need more information from what he's saying? Like, do you need him to explain that more?
I'd like to understand that better because, when you have the corporate structure, what does that mean? Does that mean we've got the leaders that are working with the lay leaders that are kind of, doing their ministry? Or, I like what you said this morning, and that, I think that's the trend we need to follow, and that's to encourage everybody to be more active.
Right. So in this size, usually it's the pastor and senior lead are doing that with the lay leaders. In here, they're doing it with the staff that are then doing it with the lay leaders. So absolutely, we all need to be involved in that way. That doesn't change in any side here. But really, that part of the function when you get here is to say, actually, there's less people are being invested in, but they're being invested more deeply, usually when they're at this size. But can you say more too? Because I think, you obviously have more context with this church and your understanding here.
Yeah, so first, I think we saw a shift with Howard having 7 direct reports recently.
Yeah.
And that has to shift. And I think that is shifting, but the other thought is that to equip, we've put people with great personalities in positions and said, go get them. I think, and that's not just First Pres Amarillo. I think that is the church as a whole. And so there's an opportunity to move to that corporate side, to give new people in ministry the training, the leadership development differently than just you've got a great personality, go get them, Tiger.
Yeah.
That's part of it. I think also with the recent, what we talked about at our table with recent changes in our staff, it just took so long to make a decision that we lost people. And so within that corporate structure, we've got to have good leadership that is in the day-to-day with the balance of the governance committee, elder-led support, all of those things, and people who are equipped to do the work, so that it's not just falling on pastoral leadership. And I don't know, Julie, if that adequately explains everything, but we're right in our personnel, org structure, governance structure. I think we are kind of at that tipping point of, are we going to be a program church that's going to stay at 350 to 400, or are we going to be a church that expands beyond that and allows us to do missional communities and this kind of stuff, and grow youth discipleship? And that's kind of how I see all of this. There's an amalgamation of a lot of things in that comment. That's where we are as an organization.
So in the corporate, you're depending on more hired staff that works with their programs.
But does so to empower the people for
Yeah.
ministry. So it's like you have more personal trainers in it, you know, if you can kind of understand that. So, and I would say, so remember this is a scale, and you guys are in, size-wise, you're in here.
Yeah.
Now, what I would say is you are functioning a little bit on both sides, but you're functioning, and because you have such great staff, honestly, you are functioning very well on this line, even though you're structured a little bit more here.
Yep.
Which tells me, if you could restructure your environment here, you would be able to, so if we look at that curve, if we say, man, if we can begin to structure more like the 800, then we will probably be able to live into that relatively quickly. So I will see churches that go from 400 to 800 actually fairly quickly when they change some of the inner workings. Or when they don't change the inner workings, as they were, 800 or something like that, and then they drop, like I said, drop to 400. So I think there's some things in here that you could change, that you could enhance. So governance being one of those things. Let me just pause a minute on the thing about acting too slow. So this is usually a big problem, and unfortunately it's a big problem in Presbyterians, is because we're so committee structured in so many ways that it takes so long to do something. And a lot of times what can happen, so I mentioned in my sermon about my children's ministry director, it was great because she was that prophetic. She's like, why does it work this way? Just because it does, right? But what would happen is, so her name is Mary Beth, and she reported to me, but there was also a Christian education committee. So she wanted to do something, and she would come to me and go, Dana, what do you think about this? I think it's great, go for it. She'd run it by the Christian education committee that was headed by a very nice guy, but an older guy who didn't have, who had grandchildren in the program, but had, I remember when we used to run VBS like this, or when we met this, and he would shoot it down, right? So who is she reporting to? We got to get both of them to agree? That can make things go really slow. So what we try to do in the governance is, and isn't it great that it's football season again, right?
Amen.
Is that what we try to say is that the pastor and the staff have a field on which they can play. There needs to be clear boundaries, right? There needs to be clear in and out. There needs to be clear goalposts here and here as far as where we're going. And then there's like okay, hey, you can't spend over budget, you can't allow illegal things to happen, you can't do, there's, you know, this thing. There's some things that, 11 decisions that the session still needs to be the ones to create. Let's articulate those lines, and then once we do that, then the pastor and staff can go ahead and run it, and can do it really quickly. So I say, you know, imagine if the, you know, when UT is playing Alabama last night, if the assistant coach is hearing the head coach in one ear and one of the members of the board of trustees in another ear.
That was the A&M game.
That was the A&M game, right? Uh-huh. Yeah, and to say, well, who am I listening to, right? The reality is we're not usually structured like this. We don't have clear, so we don't know when are we stepping out of bounds. What am I allowed to do? What am I not allowed to do? What decisions are session decisions and what decisions are staff decisions? So this is usually one of the areas that slows churches down.
That's very appropriate, yeah.
Yeah.
That's good.
So I think that's one of the things that could clear going forward.
That's good.
Let me with this too, because I think there's one interesting thing. How would you, oh, go ahead.
What was the answer on Mary Beth?
Yeah.
The answer, until we changed our structure, it was sorry, you can't do it.
And
Right?
that's where it stopped.
And that's where it stopped, right? Because this was, so you're telling me, and now what had happened, if they had said yes, but the session said no,
Yeah, there you go.
right? Now she's got to get 3 approvals to do something. So sometimes we go, oh, we function by consensus. Functioning by consensus is horrible. Because if we function by consensus at my session when we left to go eco, right? Here's what happened. We had 10 people on our session. 9 people wanted to go eco. 1 person wanted to stay Peace USA. If you function by consensus, what says is you can't do anything new unless everyone agrees. So now that 1 person has the power to keep us from going forward, where 9 people actually wanted to go in this direction. But if you focus by consensus, it is, I'm going to stay doing what I'm doing unless everyone agrees. Well, that's actually the opposite of what you're trying to do. You're trying to not put power in one particular person, right? So there's this kind of thing is hard. You have to get all 3 of these people agreed to do something new, rather than if once the session finally said, hey, listen, Dana, if you are head of staff, you oversee this person, you oversee their ministry. Then she created a team. Once we changed it, she created a team that reported to her, and there were certain limits of things she had to do. But then she could really run an idea by me, hey, this is what I'm thinking you. Great, go ahead and go for it. And in between a meeting, rather than here, she's got to come to me and go, well, you can't put this at this agenda, it's going to have to wait 2 months. So your thing about being too slow on certain things, that's usually what can happen in a Presbyterian system. So that's probably one thing that needs to be enhanced.
Some of this reminds me of the House and the Senate in Washington.
Yeah.
Not able to do anything because somebody's talking for 3 days and they all give up.
Right.
It's not like that, but it's the same scenario kind of.
Well, exactly. And what do we say about the government? We say the government is built on the Presbyterian system.
Yeah.
Sorry? Right? I mean, like, we used to be so proud of that, and now we're going, right? Should we take pride in the fact that the government is built off a Presbyterian system? I mean, I absolutely believe in elder run. And elders create the boundaries, they create the goalposts, they create these things, but then let the staff do what needs to be done more tactically and more quickly because they're working on those things within that particular boundary.
And I guess what comes to mind to me as well is that, I don't know how practical this is, but it's like, this is a new mindset for us as a congregation, and I guess my hope would be that we could educate those in the congregation and say, we're doing things a little differently. I'm not sure how far that explanation would need to be, or that education would need to be for the congregation, but just to give a heads up of that, because we anticipate new growth or something,
Yeah.
you know, that things may look a little different, and we want to be more hopefully transparent about what we're doing.
Right.
And that would be a true focus that I would hope that we could take as well.
Right. And part of it's gonna depend on how much your bylaws would need to change and so forth, but a lot of things is to say, yeah, we need to operate. And here's the big challenge. So this is the question that I wanna ask, and then we'll take a break. The big challenge is we have to be clear on the goals. So what we don't wanna do is we're not changing the structure in order to change the structure. Most churches will say, we're not gonna go to this until we've defined this. Right, we've defined the end zone. So if I ask you, and I know that there's pieces of this, how clear is where you want to be in 5 or 10 years? How clear of a picture is painted for that future? I see nods and then I see no.
Are you asking us to
Yes.
answer that? Oh.
Yeah, how clear, but before the pastor's answer.
Yeah.
Right. How clear is it to say, here's where we think God is calling us in the next 5 or 10 years?
It's sort of clear.
Sort of clear? What things are sort of clear?
Well, like what we're doing in Canyon, I mean, I think that's something that's sort of clear. I mean, that's what we're trying to reach, but, you know, it's something that we have to adjust to, depending on what's happening. So, you know, it's sort of clear, but it's not clear.
And is that, and I forgot to ask you this, Howard, did that kind of start, well, I think that started because the people came over that were already from over there, right?
Yeah, so 2 years ago, we studied the book, Breaking the Huddle.
Yep.
And it talked about coming up with a vision statement and then having clear goals for that vision statement. Our vision statement was to build Christ-centered, grace-filled communities, and we talked about how do we do that and what are the communities. And actually, I showed your video from Dallas. You talked about church planting and shared the goal of 1,000 new churches by 2030. And so we talked about planting a church, and we said, well, goodness, we already have 12 plus families coming from Canyon to us. Seems like a pretty obvious place to start.
First place.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And that was decided about 2 years ago.
Yeah. And it was after you had already created that, the desire for grace-filled communities.
Right.
Right. And probably initially when you said grace-filled communities, you were
Christ-centered, grace-filled.
Christ-centered, grace-filled communities was probably thinking internally, like we want our communities
Right,
to
triads.
be our triads and so forth. And then as this opportunity comes up and presents, well, now we're gonna react to this great opportunity that God has
Right.
put. You know?
So we had like 5 goals. One of them, Matt Klein, remember, was to start the new college class, which we did.
Yeah.
But then we found out it's actually best to minister to college students in Canyon.
Yeah.
Like having them come here at 9:30 or 9:45. They don't wake up that early. So it's kind of had to transition. So as we make a goal, we try it, and then we go, we need to adjust that.
Yeah, we need to adjust.
With the triads, that's been growing exponentially. Like, that's unbelievable
That's
how well
great.
that's going.
Yeah.
And the Canyon thing's going well, too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We still have to do alpha. We haven't really created new alpha groups we talked about doing. Yeah.
Something that I'm thinking as far, I don't know if it's a church goal, I hope it is, but a goal that I'm thinking, we want our church to grow, more people to come, but we also want to go out into the community and meet people, disciple people. Maybe they'll come to our church, maybe we'll start a new church wherever, but I think my mind has shifted a bit in just trying to really reach out to people outside of the building rather than just trying to bring them all in.
Yeah. Amen. I think so often we get in this attractional model, we just attract people to us, and then we hope they get more deeply plugged in, rather than how do we go. I mean, you know, coming from California, churches don't attract people. There's not people, oh, maybe I'll go check out a church. They just, unless they already have that preconceived idea, they're not gonna do it.
And it's really a mindset that I think I've gotten being part of the Canyon Mission community, because that's kind of what we talk about, and how what we've been doing there is trying to invite people in and then have a Bible study, a very low-key Bible study to try to encourage some new growth and new people there to join us.
Right.
We're really trying to reach out
Right.
rather than just bringing everybody in.
Yeah.
It's a different mindset.
It's a different mindset. So it's a different, and one thing, I'm gonna have us take a break and we'll come back. And what I do wanna do is go around, and I'm gonna go very quickly around kind of that EOS model, because I think there's some things in there, you go, oh yeah, we've got this and this, and actually your scores were really good, so I don't have to spend nearly as much time as I thought I would on this. However, there probably are some other things to say, well, what is the win? Is the win to get more people in triads? I think that might be part of it. Is the goal to get more people sharing their faith outside of church? That may be. Because so often we think the goal is simply just those numbers, and to say, no, we want people to be engaged, but actually the goal is, those numbers represent something, I think, maybe more important. So let's take a break, and Howard, for this size of group and given locations, is 15 minutes?
Yeah,
Good?
bathroom's right down the hall.
Okay, great. So let's come back at 2, and I want to go through this a little bit more, and I'm just trying to spark conversation and ideas as you take your next steps. And session personnel did, and and a lot of good results came back, and they were actually fairly high. Usually we don't see them. The thing for people who are not intentional about it, usually the numbers are like 20 to 40 out of 100, and yours were 73 and 74. So it was actually equal between staff and lay leaders, which is good. And then also pretty high. So my thought was there might be 1 or 2 things that we may need to dig into more deeply, but that was not evident from the numbers. It doesn't mean there's not a couple things that we ought to dig into a little bit more significantly, which we can do. I've heard some things that I'll want to comment on as we go forward. But this kind of system, this is basically saying we want to understand the entrepreneurial operating system. You are an entrepreneurial organization. Sometimes we don't like to think of the church, or the church is in a business or something like that, but you are an entrepreneurial organization. You are entrepreneuring for the name of Jesus. I think you're the most important entrepreneurial organization on the planet. I think that's the church, and that's what Jesus said, go make disciples of all nations, right? I mean, there was this mission and this call to pursue, and that may not be normally how we think of entrepreneurism. That is really what it is that you all and that we are seeking to do. So we want to say, well, what's the operating system behind that? And so part of this is going to be dependent upon this piece here. So I want to talk about each of these 6 elements and take a little bit of questions, and for you to think about what are the places that we might need to strengthen. So the first part is this part of vision. If you take what I would recommend is take your packet, and if you want to, you can tear the front sheet off if you don't want to keep looking at it, because you'll kind of refer to this, and then you'll also refer to the things in this packet, right? So you're going to always see that model in front of you, but then we'll be looking at the packet. So you can take it off or not. But this vision piece is really looking at, do we have our core values? And you do. You have core values. You have some core focus. I would say probably the thing to work on is really that 10-year target. So if we can be real clear, for example, what we're doing in Canyon is wonderful. In 10 years, and because I don't like the whole sometimes just focusing on numbers, it may be, for example, we want 1,000 people in our discipleship pathway, right? That may be better than saying we want 1,000 people here on a Sunday. Because then it doesn't, they could be here but not in the discipleship pathway, and we don't just want to look at average, at average attendance. But you say, yeah, that would be great. Gosh, if we had 1,000 people in small groups or triads or whatever that expression is, that's great. And if we said 1,000 people in a discipleship pathway, whether it was here or in other locations, that could include Canyon, it could include some other things, that could be part of the vision. So I'm not saying that needs to be your vision, but I do think to be able to quantify it a little bit more, to say we want to get clear on it so that we know what it is we're targeting. So let's just say, for example, that we wanted 1,000 people in a discipleship pathway, and I didn't just come up with something that it seems that you're very passionate about. We're reaching out to other, we want to reach out to other people. We want to get them into alpha. So it's like whether they're in alpha or a triad or a small group. I mean, that's one of the things that we want to measure. If you were to get 1,000 people into a discipleship group, or into discipleship pathway, what would have to change? Going back to this model, what would have to change in the way your staff, and maybe in particular even Howard, how would he need to change in his operation, in what he does?
He would need to work with his staff that would work with their people. It need to, everybody from the top, he would lead and he would inspire and train a group of people that would reach out to other people that would filter out into the community.
Okay. So that would, and probably Murray would need the same.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
The staff.
Yeah, the senior staff
Yeah.
level, right. And so what would they, just go with me on that for a little bit, what would they have to give up doing? A little harder, isn't it?
Some of that one-on-one stuff we were talking about.
Right.
Thinking about it's the way we've always done it, kind of thing.
Or rather than Murray and Howard having their own triads, which I don't really want them to give up their triad, but they would train those people to do triads.
Right.
Where they would lead it more than do it. But leadership is really good to watch them do it too. You know?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, but then you go back to that,
I know.
what Jesus model assist, watch and leave, or Paul's model, the apostolic model of leadership. So, yeah, I think that's part of it.
And I even talked, I mean, one of the thing I had with Howard is, it's great that you've got like Sunday school, small groups, and triads, but I like what you said at the beginning, is sometimes to watch those groups of 4 people, you know, 3, that real small group, you can get a lot more intimate and deeper with that group. And so I think you said you did the Reveal study,
Right.
which actually said that sometimes small groups are great for people to begin the journey, but actually what helps them grow deeper is those real small group relationships. So the challenge can be, hey, we offer these great Sunday schools, is that the best place for people to grow? Or is it also then maybe a hindrance, because they go, well, I'm already in a Sunday school group, I don't want to go in a triad. So sometimes that can be a messaging thing too about, well, you need to be in a triad. Now, if you want to do Sunday school in addition, great. But what's really important for us is that you're in that triad. Again, I'm not even proposing that at this point, but it is interesting when you look at the way that you're made up, it could be that some of those things that are good things could actually be impediments to where you really want people to grow, right? So just that kind of thing to think about. So, you know, that particular vision, what would have to change? How do we want to get clear on this? What other things would need to change if something like that were your vision?
I don't know how that might affect our Wednesday night programming that our ministers teach on Wednesday nights as well.
Yeah. At our last, my last, I think it was the last minister gathering, it was the year before. I mentioned how I had a guy in my congregation who, there was a young kid who said he wanted to get discipled. He was a new Christian.
Dallas.
That was in Dallas, yeah.
I've shown that video this session.
Oh, you have, okay.
Yeah, you did great.
Well, thank you, yeah. But my admitting there is what he said is because I worked with him for 6 months while he was working with someone else to disciple him. And then I see him later and he goes, that was better than all your sermons combined. Wait a second, I spend a lot of time on those sermons. And not saying give that up, but sometimes those Wednesday night things or those other things that we do, is that actually hindering us from where we really need to be putting energy? I don't necessarily know, but those are the kinds of questions that I think you're going to need to wrestle with, because you are doing so many things and they're good things, but to really be able to kind of put that rocket fuel going forward, something may need to give.
I think that's where somebody like Kent is going to really help us with the business administrative stuff. Get a lot of help in that area to free up your time to do other things.
Yeah. Well, because that's one of the things that we were saying about, you know, you guys have had some tragedies with staff and loss and so forth, and then Howard goes, well, I was a finance major and stuff, I can step into this, and it makes sense.
That was a bad idea.
Yeah. And that's the hard thing when you have the good and breadth of gifts that you have here. It's like, oh, well, I can jump in and do this, and I can jump in and do that, but it can actually keep you from doing what's most important.
I think that it's also looking at what leadership is.
Mhm.
And it's like, we need leadership.
Yep.
But yet, leadership also means that you need to have the space to give to leadership.
Right.
And if we're taking on other duties, other hats,
Mm-hmm.
you don't have it, you don't have the energy to be giving to leadership.
Right.
And, I mean, to whatever your gift is.
Yeah.
And so, and there are, yes, I mean, we have some very strong leaders that are not clergy
Mhm.
and that have taken on a lot of roles within the church. And that's a good thing.
That's a great thing.
And I'm sure we'll have more.
Yeah.
But I think it's recognizing, you know, use your gifts. And
Right.
come from that strength.
Yeah. And the problem is, most pastors, the congregation doesn't get, the congregation will never, usually, I mean, unless you're mature and really think about it, the congregation leadership will never say, you're not discipling enough people, right? That's usually not the metric. The metric is you're not preaching enough, you're not doing enough hospital care, no one is going to be pushing for the things that are actually the most important things to do. It's gonna be all the voices, and I'm not saying those are bad voices, but it's gonna be all the voices that are gonna redirect energy that needs to change.
Yeah, it's gotta sap the energy.
Right.
It's, yeah.
But can we train them to think otherwise?
Absolutely.
So-
Absolutely. And that's again where the goalpost is, to say if this is where we need to go, this is how we need to be able to function. That's why we want vision to drive it, not just, and we don't even want to say it's just because Howard and Murray don't have enough time to do it. It's actually because we want to release the gifts of the people. In my congregation, you wanted other people to do pastoral care, right? Like they were great at it, and I know how to do it, and I can do it, decently well, but that's not my normal gifting. Well, when I could release people to do it, that was their gift. It was great, it was fantastic. So this is that vision piece, is to say we definitely want to get clear there, and if we can do that, then the second part is the people part. So if you look at look a little bit, these are just these kind of one-year goals and rocks, and I'll talk about that later. But really what makes if you look at the people analyzer and the accountability chart, here's where I think is one of the biggest shifts, and one of the things that can potentially be very helpful in moving in this different direction, is to be able to say again, this is a for-profit type company structure, so we have to make some interpretations. But you got your visionary here, and then what we're talking about is we have this integrator here. And what is going to be really important is that these two people work together. And so what the analogy, again, sorry for the overly football analogy, but to create a hole for somebody to run through, how many blockers does it take?
2.
Yeah, thank you, right? Yeah. One on each side, right? So what the visionary can do is say, well, I'm going to set the direction. That's part of my blocking, is I'm going to set the direction for where you're going to go. But if I need Howard, if I'm a staff member, and I need Howard to be able to say, hey, well, can we make sure like the processes are in place and all of this for me to be able to go through, that's going to be too much for him. That's trying to like defend two people. So we want the visionary to really be able to set the stage, and maybe somebody that's an integrator who's saying, okay, how do we take that vision and how do we make sure that the whole system is living it out really well, and that people are accountable to it, and so forth. So it may be too then that you say, for example, if you say, gosh, I love what we're doing in Canyon, I actually, we as a session think we ought to do that in 5 different locations, right? So you kind of think of that. That's certainly not outside the realm of possibility. Well, now it's going to be, for Howard to be a primary leader in that role of actually implementing it here is going to be challenged. Even for Murray, it's going to be challenged. You need someone who's really focused. How do we get that into the totality of the organization so that the pastors can really do what they're free to do? So I said, yeah.
One thing in our case in particular is seeing the success of the lead project.
Yes.
Now you can get people excited about doing it again and again and again.
Yes. Yeah, it can be, it's very hard to get people excited for the first one. It's much easier when it goes well to get people excited for the second and third.
Yeah.
And so now first thing it says, you mean we, as First Presbyterian Amarillo, we could have an influence, to reach into 5 different communities. I'm just, making that up. Like, that's exciting. And yeah, we will be willing to let Howard and Murray use their gifts to be able to teach and to cast vision and so forth. But we're going to need systems in place in order to do that. We're going to have to operate a lot more like this than like this, right?
Just had this idea, and I didn't make this up. Now, I may have mentioned this to Howard and maybe one other or not, but we need to be on the watch for people who are coming to our church who are here to try to destroy it.
Mm.
They will be.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they're here and we don't know it. But I'm not sure how we will identify those people, if we should be looking for them or not, or let them look for us, or to identify themselves by saying something that one of us. But have you had that idea before?
Well, sometimes, usually not overtly trying to come to destroy it.
Yes.
Well, he's talking
overtly?
about disruptors, like, for instance, like the wolf in the sheep's clothing.
Right.
Like the people who are divisive, we've had the situations where the one no vote was really loud.
Yes.
And he got other people to get on board with this, and it delayed a process that seemed pretty obvious to most people, but finally we got through it, but it can certainly cause some problems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's where having those clarity on your core values and what it is that we're looking and having with the nominating process and all of that, and just being real clear, this is who we are, and being a united. I was just talking with a church with guys poor pastors getting beat up by 3 people in the congregation, really hard. And I kind of yelled at the session. They're like, oh, we're behind the pastor. I said, that's the problem, is you're behind the pastor. Y'all need to get out in front of the pastor, and you need to take some of these arrows and you need to put these people in their place once and for all. They're like, ooh, I'm like, you need to, because this pastor's getting beat up. So yeah, you need to be clear, and you need to be clear as session, and you need to be watchful for that, and just to say, no, this is where we are, and here, that's what's great about having those lines, because it absolutely happens. So those kind of structure, then if we think, hey, we're going to multiply this out in a big way, well, then we may need to structure ourselves differently. Okay, so that's really the people part of it, and then also making sure that your people are living out your values. So like one of our values internally as a staff with ECO is that we're for continuous improvement. So if you don't want to be a part of something where you're going to do something and you're going to get feedback for it, and we're going to try to always, get better at the things we're doing. If that's not something you want to do, then this isn't going to be a great fit for you, right? So that's one of those particular values. Then we move over to the data piece, and this is interesting. It's Julie, right? Is it Julie? Yeah. So I like what you said about, gosh, I just feel this heart that we need to reach out. We need to reach out more. We need to know this. So the most things that we measure are people who are in here on a Sunday, and people who are, and obviously giving and so forth. But what if we measured something different? What if we measured, again, how many people are in a discipleship relationship? That's a great thing to measure. Maybe it's how many of our people have relationships with those who don't know the Lord and are using those for gospel purposes. That's a harder question to ask, but it gets a whole lot more exciting to say, this is our data. So now these are things that are scorecard and measurable. So now I might want to say, I want 80% of our people to be in triads, because that's what's most important. Again, just giving it as an example. So whether they're in Sunday school, that's great. It's a great addition, and we can do that. We eventually, in 5 years, we want 80% of our people to be in triads. If that's the goal and that's the numbers that are most important, you're going to structure yourself differently, and you're going to communicate differently than if the goal is to get everybody in Sunday school, or the goal is just to get people to worship attend more often. If your goal is, we want every person in a congregation, I did this in my church, we want everybody to identify their 5, which is who's the 5 people that are close to you and far from Jesus. And we want each elder has to do this, And we want each person to do this, and in whatever discipleship group you're in, you share those 5 people, and we're gonna be praying for those 5 people, right? So that's what percentage of our people have their top 5? Well, that's another metric that's different. Just giving an example, not saying it's something that you need to adopt, but I think that kind of stuff is more important than simply just how many people were here on Sunday.
Just real quick, and I'm sure we all know this, but so our path of discipleship is worship and then Sunday school. And Sunday school is intended to be a place of connection to help find your triad members. So the idea is it's actually a strategy for the triad. It's a strategy for going deeper, intended all along. And that's why every elder is actually one of the requirements now is that you're involved with the Sunday school. So we want you to be the shepherd of your class, identifying the guest and the visitor, and helping them connect to a triad small group.
Yeah. So see, that's really, what'd you say?
I said I was not in a Sunday school when I was picked as an elder.
As elder, right.
But on communion prep and circle and was in a triad and was in a lot of other things. And I think that I'm on the nominating committee, and that's being used to eliminate people that are potentially really good to be elders when they're still involved in the church. And I'm not sure that that should be the only thing that you should look at.
Sure, but we do, I mean, this is where, whatever our core strategy is, so I do think whatever our core strategy is, the elders need to be involved in that. I mean, that's, now, you know, to what extent that's true or not true, something is things that can be looked at, but that's part of that people component, is that the people are so forth. But whatever it is, just the idea that we want to get real clear on what our goals, what our measurables are. I mean, I'd love to see, you know, how many first-time guests become covenant partners of the church. Most churches don't have, you know, ideas of that. Now, sometimes guests don't give you your information, but I want to know from the people that picked up Howard's, you know, thing that he said,
Gift bag.
Your gift bag, either that. Or sometimes people don't pick that up, but they're dropping kids off at Sunday school, so you're getting new people's information every week. How many of those people are becoming members? Most churches would say 20 to 30%. Actually, the number is going up because more people check you out online before in person. So if they're going to get turned off by your worship, they're going to get turned off when they're at home by your worship and never show up. So by the time they come to the front door, they've already had more experience with your church. And so they're much more likely to stay involved. So I think the numbers ought to be 50 or 60% of the people that come first time, who are potential covenant partners. So I'm not talking about Aunt Sally who flew up from Houston for the baptism this weekend, you know, that kind of thing, but real people that could become part of the church. I think that number ought to be 50 or 60. Well, now we got to look at, it's only 10 or 20. Where's the gap, right? We want to be identifying those kinds of things. We want to be real clear on, what are our issues? What are the things that we need to solve? And to be able, going back to that thing here of solving it slow versus solving it quick, what are the issues and what is the appropriate group to deal with it? So it may be that the issue is something that the session needs to deal with. Fine, let's make sure it's in front of them. First, it may be an internal staff issue. Let's make sure we deal with that first. And then this part here is on process. So part of that's where it can be a little bit challenging in a church of saying, well, what are the various processes that we have? So we might have processes to bring in a new person, right, that becomes a new covenant partner. What is that process? Or what is the process of helping people connected to Sunday school? What are the processes of these things? Smaller churches tend to be more haphazard. Larger churches tend to be more intentional. So what are those intentional processes and how are we following them? And then the last part on traction really is, are we having the right kind of meetings? Are we having the right kind of meetings? So we know what are our core issues, we're solving them. These are the rocks here. So I think it's important to be able to say for every 90 days for our staff, what are the things that we need to accomplish this particular quarter, and we're clear about that. Because we know we can get our time sucked in so many different areas. And it could be, we need, in this 90 days, we need a plan to be able to create, a discipleship pathway, or we want a plan to create a new, where's the next new community going to be, if that is as a replicable strategy that you want to be able to avoid or to embrace. And when you have all these things working together, you can find that, oh, this is actually going to streamline our energy. It's going to make sure we're on the same page. We're gonna discuss in a different way. So I think a lot of times I will say, hey, as long as people want to go, as long as we all want to go in the same direction, I am perfectly fine with multiple disagreements about how best to get there. The challenge is when you want to go here and we want to go there, and we're spending, and the session and the church has said, here's where we're going, and people come on and they want to go in different directions. So those are one of the things that we want to clear up. Now, like I said, what was interesting when you all took your assessment, I was expecting that one of these things, one or two of them might be real high, and there might be one or two that are pretty low to work on. Yours was kind of interesting because it was, like I said, 73 and 74, and it was pretty evenly spread out between all of the areas, which was good. There was no one place where it's like, oh, this part is really, really low, or this part is really, really high. They were all equally fairly high. But I wonder, so as I go through that, I wonder where do you think you might need to work?
I think we need to see alignment on the 10-year vision.
Okay.
And specific. I think we generally know, but I don't think in this room we could all articulate that and put a target on the map.
Well, and I think further than that, communicate that vision then to the church as a whole.
Yeah.
Not just this group that turns over every third year.
And I did like especially some of the measures that you mentioned. Those were pretty exciting to hear.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure about 1,000 being discipled, but
Ruth was
But
thinking
it's
10,000, not 1,000.
The what?
She was thinking 10,000.
You're aiming too low.
Yeah, but I mean, that was exciting,
Mhm.
and that would be great to have some specific measures.
And by the way, whatever measures you come up with, the thing is you don't want it to be like, oh yeah, the staff can do that.
Right.
It has to be something, that's why a larger number where 1,000 may seem hard, but it's, if you look at some of those multiplication things and you may say, maybe it's 500 or whatever, you want people to go, yeah, it's not just them that have to do it, and it's not just us in this room, we have to own it as a congregation.
Well, I think Howard has been really good to inspire our whole congregation to reach out. And they give us these little cards all the time to invite people.
He gave me like 5 of them.
Those are wonderful.
He was invited to play to a baseball game with Ed Stetzer. I gave him the note. He's like, "Oh, I'm supposed to go to a game with him today."
Yeah.
Really
I came to you instead of going to sit in an air-conditioned suite at a baseball.
With Ed Stetzer.
But I mean, he is really trying to inspire the whole group, and that's what my dream is that each member in our church could be inspired to go talk to their neighbor.
Yeah.
And we get that a lot from the pulpit.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been inspired, and I just wonder how many people in our church are that familiar with the Canyon mission. Some of our groups are, but I talk to some people and they're like, they don't know that.
Sure.
So I just wonder, about that.
Yeah, I know what they did the E-Chimes article. People don't really read E-Chimes.
We're having a commissioning service on the 8th.
That's right, October 8th, yep.
Yeah, so those ways, but those kind of, I think it gets exciting when you go, here's some targets that really are important and not just to keep our organization going, but here's some things that are really important. We want each one to reach one, right? That kind of, well, that's great. If that means we've got to be equipped and we have to be praying for our 5 and we have to be doing these, which is going to then change to say, then we have to ask, well, are our people equipped to do that? And there might be some things, because we can, I'm not saying this happens here, but I know I used to be able to guilt my people into saying, you're not, you know, I mean, I didn't say it like that, but it's like, you need to be doing this, you need to be doing that kind of thing, that I don't know how. I have no idea. Oh, okay, well then there's some systems we need to put in place to help make that a reality.
Murray, I'm curious, do you have you call all our people who visit, he mentioned that percentage of,
Wow,
what percentage of them
yeah.
actually join? What
That's
would you say?
that's pretty interesting. That was, but they
Yeah.
know us more, but they get here already, they already know stuff.
Yeah, how do you, have you seen that shift, and where do you think we are in that spectrum? Because I mean, I'll have lunches with folks and it'd be great, and then we're like, okay, new members class, and we don't always show up just because it's the wrong weekend for them or whatever, but do you have a sense of how many?
Well, I mean, a lot of folks don't feel they need to join anymore. It's like
There's
people,
that.
it's like people living together. They don't feel like they get married, right?
Mhm.
So it's a little bit of that feel. I can come and enjoy. Why don't I need to join? That is not a big deal. So
Yeah.
you get a lot of that kind of feel.
Yeah.
And then they get nominated for officer, and it turns out they're not even
members.
Yeah,
Right. So, and that could be the thing of saying, well, how many people make this their church home, right? That even if they don't, I think it's very important for people. I do think it's important for people to join and so forth. But if that's the challenge, then it's like, okay, well, maybe do we say, well, what percentage of person end up making this their church home, and how will we know what measure? Or, in Baptist land is, how many baptisms we had. But you can rebaptize a ton of people like all the time. So
we only do it once.
Yeah, you don't do it. So what
we can really crank up our numbers if we change our theology.
Exactly. Yeah. But what we used to say was part of our number is we want half of our new members to be people who have been functionally unchurched for at least 5 years. Right. Meaning, because again, we were in Florida, so people move there, and they're moving from another church. Fine, we're happy to have you, whether you're from out or if you're local and that's happening, then we want to have some other conversations. But what we really want is we want people who make new or renewed professions of faith, and so they wouldn't get back. But that to us was a win, rather than just how many new people we had. Is that, you can see how these numbers like, oh yeah, if I do that, that seems better than just simply saying how many people we have.
Yeah, I see that we're on track in a lot of ways. When I look at our vision, I guess what I was thinking about was that exact target,
Yeah.
and then answering those 8 questions so that it's more than Christ-centered, grace-filled communities.
Mm-hmm.
It is that we could articulate the answer to those 8 questions about our core, about all of those things. And then the other thing about just from session perspective, the rhythm, the discipline of looking at this in a systematic way is so powerful in the system that we're looking at the same scorecard every month. We're looking at the same, or every week in the businesses that I use this with.
Yeah.
But that data and that process, I think, are absolutely critical to a system like this. That we've got the target, we're revisiting rocks, and that becomes more a part of session, and that helps us define those boundaries, I think, a little bit better too. So it's a powerful tool.
Yeah, it was funny when I was talking to them. He goes, "Oh, I know EOS. I use it with my with the companies I work with." Oh, great. Yeah.
Well, you also mentioned the continuous improvement. I think that there's that buy-in as well from us as session that we, it is looking at issues and saying it's about change, and it's about, are we following Jesus's model?
Mm-hmm.
And have we kind of veered this time? Well, let's go back to that model. And,
right.
But you have to be pretty, once again, transparent about where you're walking and what you're measuring. And so.
Well, and with that, when we say Christ-centered, grace-filled communities, then we've got to be specific about that. Then, because sometimes our goal at my last church, and this was before I really dug in too deeply on it, our goal was how many people are in small groups. Well, that's not, even that is like, we felt proud that we were like, well, it's not just about people in the pews, it's how many people are in small groups. But we had one small group that had 3 divorces and 1 suicide. So I'm going, well, they were in a small group, and this happened within the course of 2 years. And I'm not blaming the leader of that or anything like that, but I would say, just because they were in it doesn't mean it was doing what it was supposed to be doing. So what are the elements of a Christ-centered, grace-filled community? And now we might be able to say, how is our group functioning like that? Do we have these elements in there, and where it might need to be improved, right? Which is beyond it. This takes a lot more time and energy, but you're like, okay, no, we're actually focused. That's great. Christ-centered, graceful community, that's what we want. Now let's really define that and make sure, now how do we equip our people to create those communities?
And how do we measure the spiritual growth?
Right. Right. Yeah, and that can be hard, or it can be, well, what percentage of our people have personal growth plans, regardless of where it is. That's, that could be there's a lot of things that you could put in there. So I've heard you say, yeah, probably these 2 things, and then maybe along with that is something that is getting a little bit like, oh yeah, we're really going to have to free some staff up in a different way, so this might need to change as well. So what I'm hearing is that top part is maybe where we really need to focus, and then some of this other stuff we can build in with it once we get the top part nailed. And I would recommend working on those 2 things first. Because if you can get that, then we know, well, what issues we need to solve, and what issues, like, that's not really an issue because it's not related to our vision and where it is God's taking us. So again, we were supposed to meet a longer time, because I thought you'd have more in there. I thought you'd have more issues, more stuff. But I do want to have, hey, if you got questions or thoughts, like, this is a good time to get some interaction that can really help you kind of take your next step forward.
So I know that our denomination has a 10-year goal. I heard it in 2020, right before COVID really impacted the whole world. We were in Dallas again. Mm-hmm. It was a great vision. I thought it was great. 1,000 micro expressions, new churches by 2030. I said, that sounds awesome. But then, again, kind of Presbyterian, thinking about the words of James, the epistle. If it be the Lord's will, we'll go X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
10 years is so far out. Like, how practical is to what sense? I hate to get too, but it's like, if it's the Lord's will, we'll do this in 10 years. But I don't know why 10 years, maybe 5? I've heard shorter goals are actually easier because it's more measurable, more system. 10 years, who knows? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So part of that, if you look on that first part about the vision traction organizer, I think what's really helpful in this is a 3-year picture, and then a 1-year plan, which is really saying, hey, here's the general direction that we want to be going. And we want to articulate it, and we want to nail it, but we really want to look at the next 3 years picture. What is that? And we can really focus on the 3 and the 1 and the 90. Let's do that more deeply. And there's times where I think we need to be open, in a sense, to what the Spirit is doing, but also having some sense of clear direction and focus that is going to allow us to make those right decisions. So that if somebody gives us, money for something, or sometimes things just fall in our lap, well, then we go in that direction just because it came to us, and maybe it's a wolf in sheep clothing kind of a situation.
I was curious, after your sermon this morning, when you went from pre-med and middle of med school into this.
Oh, it was the last quarter of my senior year in college, and I was volunteering and working at a church, and I was working on an ambulance at the same time, and just I was deciding then, and we took someone, it was a very sad situation, who had a heart attack was a 50-year-old man who had a heart attack took him in the hospital, through the ambulance door, and then you see his daughter. It was his daughter's prom, and she comes in and she's just, tears all over the place and mascara down, and just very sad situation. And my boss and the paramedic said, "Aren't you glad you're not on that side of the door, right? That you don't have to deal with that. You can just deal with the patient." I'm like, actually, I kind of wish I was out there. And that's when I said, oh, that's that. It was that beginning. That was the beginning of the movement. Yeah.
So you're good at pastoral care visits. I mean, that's.
I can do them.
You want to be there in the crisis.
Well,
yeah, that's great.
what I always like to, I want to shepherd people to go in, but the long term kind of things, that's not as much. Yeah. But immediate crisis. Great.
I'm curious because you have several churches in our denomination who have multiple services, and
Yep.
Jim Singleton was here years ago, and he said, what you really have is 3 congregations because with 3 different, because the same group of 100 see the same group of 100 every Sunday, and it's only in the summer when we actually do some combined services like Memorial Weekend, Labor Day weekend. That it's like, oh, I didn't know you went to our church, So how again, we have so many churches in Eco. How many churches are operating that corporate model? Like, are there a lot, or is that pretty small at this point? Or?
Probably 30.
About 30.
Yeah, about 30 are in this general range.
But the majority are in the program or in the pastor?
Yeah, I mean, there's majority are probably, in here and here are in those. And I would say with that, when people talk about 3 congregations, I mean, it really is how you look at it. At my last church, we had 3 services. We had a very traditional service, and a very contemporary service, and a very traditional service. We would have loved your pipe organ, by the way. Like, if we had that, they would have been thrilled in that traditional space. And so people said, well, it feels like 3 congregations. But we also had a separate not-for-profit that ministered to people in emotional, physical, spiritual needs. So some similar things to what you were doing. And so when people would say we're different congregations, I'd say, yeah, but we're not. We have 3 worship services, but we have one focus. And I think that's why that's so important, to be able to say, here's our vision and here's where we're going. And it doesn't matter if you go to 8:30, 10:55, or 11:05, right? It really doesn't matter, because what matters is the vision where God is taking us. And you don't need to know everybody, right? Like, and even if just because you're in the same room doesn't mean you know them. Go to a baseball game, right? How do you know all of those people? And plus, I'll say to churches, I've met all you people. You don't need to know everybody. You don't want to know everybody, right? So I get a little bit. I do think some congregations that have multiple services do function like 2 different churches. But I think if there is a unifying vision, then in some ways you might have different personalities in each congregation, but if we're all going in the same direction, then it really doesn't matter.
Well, if you're involved in small groups, you're connected with all 3 services.
Right.
With people from all 3 services.
With people from all 3 services.
Yeah. Sunday school, Wednesday
Sunday
nights.
school does that.
And it gets intergenerational real quick.
Yeah. And if we're at the same service, but you sit on the left side and I sit on the right side, and we come in, I still may never talk to you, right? And it doesn't actually.
And I'm just curious, how many people in this group go to all 3 services? I mean, like, I go to the 8:30, I go to the 11, and I go to the 11:05. Not all on the same day, but I like all of them.
Yeah.
And sometimes I have a job, serving communion, and so I just go. I like all of them. Do anybody else go?
I do.
Yeah,
I do too.
Same
Yeah.
thing.
Oh,
We're
So
never on the
it's
same
not
service
like
each
all
week.
of us are at one service all the time.
Right. Yeah. We'd call you church sweats. You go to all the all kinds of, but ours were so different. Like on a scale, we were like a 2 on the contemporary and a 9 on the traditional, and so it was really like that. There was very few people that crossed over, but we would serve homeless families or families in significant poverty, and we would do it family style. We'd have 8 people at a table, and you and I might be helping to serve at that same table, and we may go to different services. But we're far more connected because we're serving together than just sitting in the same worship service.
Next steps.
Yeah.
How do we implement?
Well, I would definitely, and there's a lot of, and I can pass on some material about how can you clarify those 2 things. And one, you've done so much of this stuff too, but that would be the next step, is to really say, okay, we've got our values, we know that things are important. what will that look like in 10 years? And let's try to get as tangible as possible. And then let's try to say, well, then what are the most important things we ought to be measuring if that's the case? And then what does our staffing structure need to look like? So you're at a season, and we in ECO, we did the same thing where we said, well, here's what we would love to see in the future for staffing structure. And it may be somebody's role gets shifted a little bit, but what do we want to live into as a staffing structure? And then how do we need, it may be what changes need to be made. I'm not saying, letting people go and so forth, but what different roles and responsibilities need to be there. That would be the biggest things. And I can send you guys some sample things of how to do that.
Great. Other questions for Dana?
Do you see that our session and our deacons are set up properly to move forward with this, or would we need to make some shifts there as well?
You probably, yeah, that's a great question. I probably want to look at your bylaws and operational manual, because you have a separate board of trustees. So I'd really want to look at how that is good, because that can be, in some situations it can be great. In other situations it can be like the Senate and the House, that disagree on some stuff. So there could be some things there that need to be shifted. So I don't know exactly how it's set up, but I think it's definitely worth a good look.
Other questions for Dana? Can we thank Dana for his time?
Yay!
Let's close in prayer and pray for Dana. He's got
thank
more
you.
traveling to do. So, God, thank you so much for our brother Dana and just his leadership in our denomination here this morning with us. Pray your blessing upon Dana and Beth and their 3 kids. And pray for him in his travels to Dallas today, but then going to London later. Lord, just continue to guide him as he seeks to share your vision and help equip our denomination and the churches within our denomination to be all that we can in making disciples of Jesus, knowing the great commission you've given to us. And so I thank you, Lord, for everyone here, our elders and our members of personnel who are trying to do all that we can to make the most of the time, talents, and treasures you've entrusted to us, that we might bring glory and honor to you. So, Lord, I pray your will to be done in and through us this day and every day. Your son's name we pray, and all God's people said,
Amen.
Amen. Thanks, guys.